Greetings, this is the Future Trends Forum for this week. I'm Brian Alexander, the forum's creator and chief cat herder. I'm very glad to see all of you here, and I'm very looking forward to our conversation today. But before we begin the conversation, let's dive into where the forum comes from, how it works, who supports it, and then we'll introduce this week's guest. So, Tara, if you put the first slide, please. So you should know that the forum is a discussion-oriented platform. This is aimed at having conversations about the future of education. And this comes out of another project called the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report. And that's a weekly or monthly trends analysis that looks at the trends reshaping higher education and technology. If you haven't seen it before, go to ftte.us. We actually have a major change coming up in the report, so stay tuned for that. But if you haven't looked at it, download a few issues, sign up, and learn more. Now, over to the next slide, please. The Future Trends in Technology and Education Report and the Future Trends Forum together are part of a project called the Future of Education Observatory. Now, this is a multi-pronged, multimedia, open, social, and continuous attempt to try to grapple with where higher education is going. So it includes the FTTE report, it includes this forum, it also includes a blog, it includes a bookstore, it includes a book club. So if you'd like to learn more, go to futureofeducation.us and you can learn a great deal right there. Next slide, please. So before we go further, I want to thank as well the people who helped make this program possible. So the first I'd like to thank is NYSERNet from New York State. And that's a nonprofit that helps get that state's colleges and universities online to broadband speeds. They do great work in that state, and we're very grateful to them for their generous sponsorship. We're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can tell, Shindig makes available the technology we're using now. This is brilliant stuff, and let me just walk you through it so you can see how it works. And keep in mind, again, the purpose here is conversation. Right where I am, and right where this slide is for the next couple of seconds, this is the stage. Everybody can see and hear what goes on here. This is where our guest will join us in just a few seconds, and this is also where you can join us. I'll show you how. Now, below us, if you look around, you'll see what I think of as the participant swarm. So looking right now, I can see Lil Badur, I can see Lisa Stevens, I can see Kelly Walsh and Jeffrey Bryman. I can see all kinds of people here moving back and forth. If you'd like to have a private conversation with one of those people, just mouse over to their icon, double click on it, and if they feel up to talking with you, your two icons will click together like Legos. You can have your own private audiovisual bubble conversation. Now, if you want to talk with everybody else, let me show you 3 ways. Look at the very bottom of the screen. There's a white strip running along it that has a few different options. On the leftmost edge, you'll see what looks like a number with a few heads and a box. Click that, and it will pop 2 different boxes. The one on your left will be a kind of film strip, a list of everybody who's in right now. So you can just quickly mouse over and see that there's Rob Paragudov, who's at the UBC Sauer School of Business. You can see there's Ellie Bauserman at Shenandoah University. It's a nice way to just quickly see who all is here. Now, on the right side of that is a different box, which is a chat box. So for you and the roughly 18 or so people who have just joined you, you're all together and you can chat throughout the entire hour. And this is often a good place to meet people, to say hi. And in fact, if you haven't already done so, just take a second to say who you are and where you're from. But it's also a good place to share links and other topics that come up. So the chat box is one. Back to that white strip. Next to the chat box button, there's a little question mark with a circle around that. If you mouse over that, it says ask. Now that, if you click that, will give you the option to type in a question that you can ask us, hence the name. And when the time is right, we'll flash that question in text on the screen, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can see and everyone can hear it. Now, as a third way, next to that ask question is a little raised hand icon. If you touch that, that'll tell us that you want to join us on stage. So if your mic is working and your camera is working and you're in a place where you can speak out loud, click that and we'll bring you up on stage so you can talk with us. In fact, it's really easy to do if your technology is working. And now, those are 3 different ways that you can ask questions, share your thoughts, push back our discussion, or offer examples. Please use any of those during the next hour. We'd love to hear from you. And we're also very grateful to Shindig for making available this technology lets us do it. We're also grateful to another source of sponsorship, which is our friends at Patreon. So if you haven't been there, Patreon is a crowdfunding site that lets you support people making creative stuff. In this case, it's our project to make stuff about the future of education technology. So you can see from this window that there's a bunch of people who contribute, people like Chris Lott, Michael Higgins, Ginny Kim Han, Paul McConaughey, Kyle Johnson, Bob Johnson, Corey S., Robin DeRosa, Michael Slade, and Tom Hames, who should be here in this call right now. If you haven't seen this before, go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, or in fact, go to the leftmost bottom corner of your screen. You should see a widget there that says Support the Future Transform Patreon, and you can learn more. We're really grateful to the dozens and dozens of sponsors on Patreon for helping make all of this possible. Thank you. So that's who makes this possible. That's how the technology works, and that's where all this comes from. This week, we have a guest, a special guest, Bernard Bull. So Tara, over to the next slide, please. Bernard is someone that I've never met before, but he and I have worked together because I have been a guest on his podcast. Bernard creates the Moonshot.edu show. This is a podcast that looks at very ambitious goals for where education technology could be going. He's also, on the side, when he's not being a major podcaster, he's a vice provost for curriculum and academic innovation, as well as associate professor of education at Concordia University in Wisconsin. I'm really looking forward to hearing from what he has discovered about the major possible goals that we could have in higher education. So let's move this slide out of the way, and let's bring Bernard Bull back up on stage. Bernard, can you hear and see us? Okay.
I can hear and see you.
Fantastic. As befits a major podcaster, your sound quality is beautiful. Where are you today? Where have I found you?
I am sitting in my office at Concordia University, Wisconsin, about 200 yards from Lake Michigan.
Oh, lovely, lovely. Is this where you normally record your programs?
No, not usually. I have a home library, and the books are wonderful insulation. They create great sound quality. I don't know. I don't know if you can hear in this room with the stone. It usually works okay. Sometimes I get interviews at the end of the day after a work day, but yeah, I usually record at home.
I understand. Well, listen, it's terrific to see you here. I'm really grateful you'd be able to make the time to join us. Can you just take a minute and introduce yourself to everybody? Tell us what you do and what you work on.
Sure. So in terms of my day job, as you mentioned, I serve as Vice Provost for Curriculum and Academic Innovation, and that involves I oversee the leadership teams that run our online operations. We have a team of about 30 that have grown our online from a few hundred to a few thousand in a few years, and also oversee our off-campus operations. We have a number of off-campus centers that have kind of blended into blended learning over the years. I mean, students have kind of self-blended. And then I also work with faculty across all schools, and I help lead initiatives for exploring the viability of new programs, anything from are we ready to launch an engineering program to looking ways to update existing academic programs. And I get to work with faculty on fun academic innovations, like this summer, academic innovation teams for faculty who are interested in augmented and virtual reality and its implementation or its possibilities in the classroom. So that's my day job. And I am a dreamer and a writer and ethnographic researcher. So I learn largely through observation and interviews. And that's actually how my podcast was born. I have a blog called E-Tail that preceded the podcast. And that one gets a good million or so followers a year. And the blog is 1,000 articles of my rough draft, random thoughts, typos, and all. As I'm learning and interviewing people, along the way, people started asking me. I mentioned interviews that I have and places I visited, and they wondered if I could kind of invite them behind the scenes. So that's actually what was the impetus for the podcast. Was some of the interviews that I do as part of my research, I kind of invite them onto the podcast in more informal fashion as I'm exploring different themes and topics.
Wow.
And then as I mentioned, I write too. I'm just finishing my 7th book. It was due to the publisher 10 days ago. It's still not there, but it will be there by Monday.
Oh my gosh, what's this new book about?
This one, so I do a lot of work on in a variety of topics because Concordia is a faith-based school. So a couple of my books have dealt with what's unique about faith-based situations. So this newest one is actually a collection of fictional case studies about challenges in the classroom of faith-based schools. So
Wow.
that's kind of fun. I have two co-authors, so I'm the editor and contributor of 10 of the chapters.
Only 10. Wow.
Right.
Well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your the eternal struggle of writer with publisher to meet with us. Thank you, and good luck. Good luck getting that manuscript in.
Thanks.
Thanks. Wow. Well, friends, if you're new to the program, if you haven't seen The Future Transformed before, the idea here is that I'll have a few questions for our guest, and I'm sure that Bernard will cut loose, but the more important thing is to hear your questions and your thoughts. So as we go, please use any of those technologies I mentioned before, the question, the ask, the raise hand to join us in video, or the text box, in order to throw questions at us as we go. So just let me begin with saying, you've done this Moonshotedu podcast for how long now? About 2 years?
Yeah, a little under. I just finished my 60th episode, and the idea is to do one a week. But I did take a little break. I was on sabbatical. I had a fellowship out at Wesleyan University last year, so I did a lot of recording during that time. But I did take a little break.
Well, in that case, let me ask. Looking back at half 100 podcasts and so many great guests, what are some of the leading moonshots that you've seen and heard so far? And before do you want to introduce the idea of a moonshot and explain what that is?
Oh, yeah. So the idea of the Moonshotedu show is simply based on JFK's moonshot, right? His challenge to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely by the end of the 60s. And he, that famous moonshot speech. In fact, I have a friend who might even be listening, and she helped me hunt down the tie, a replica of the tie that JFK wore during that speech. And whenever I think I have a big day to work, I actually wear that tie. So anyway, it's after that concept of the moonshot. And I know that I was actually highlighted in an interview in another book that was called Mission, Not Moonshots. It was actually a critique of the idea of moonshots. And many times people use the word moonshot to mean that you're kind of a dreamer or unrealistic dreamer, and maybe even have your head in the sand a little bit. I was trying to redeem the term. I wanted to redeem it and celebrate it as a positive thing. People who have a clear mission-minded, grand vision for what could be, and they're actively pursuing it and trying to make it happen. And that's really how I use the term. So everyone on the show gets that question. The last question of the interview is always, do you have a moonshot? And I actually have some people who hate the question, and they'll tell me my moonshot is that people stop having moonshots. But I still ask.
Well, so those who don't hate the idea, what are some of the exciting ones that they've offered? What are the ones that have impressed you the most?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the ones that intrigue me the most are oftentimes not the clearest or cleanest. They're more ideological moonshots, or they're ideas that are intriguing to me. And I don't know if they'd even frame them as a moonshot. So, for example, David Labaree is at Stanford University. He's a researcher. I've followed his work. I look over here on my shelf, and I can find 6 of his books that are within arm's reach, most of the time. And he wrote a great book called A Perfect Mess, The Unlikely Ascendancy of American Higher Education, right? So when I read the book, instantly I thought, I've followed his work for so long, I would love to invite him on the show and talk to him, knowing full well, though, that he and I ideologically have some pretty significant differences in some areas. I mean, I'm much more comfortable with the progressive movement and educational innovation experimentation. He's much more cautious about some of that. But I really appreciate his work. And the premise of his book is that what makes the American higher education system so powerful or even magical is that it's a mess. And that if we try to clean it up, if we try to make it too neat and tidy and orderly that we'll destroy the essence of what makes American higher ed so powerful. And so that's not typically how we would frame a moonshot, but the idea that keep higher ed messy, that was a fascinating moonshot for me. And it's one that actually resonates a lot because I make a consistent argument for the importance of having a rich and diverse educational ecosystem. As long as students are diverse, we need philosophies and models and types of learning experiences that are diverse. And so I was able to really connect with that mission.
Nice, nice. So if that's a kind of anti-moonshot, or it's a kind of grungy moonshot, what's another moonshot that really impressed you?
Well, I also pride myself on looking for moonshots that aren't as well known. So I venture into areas where people might not, they might not know about them. So I pride myself on knowing about some of these initiatives before they pop up on EdSurge or other news sources. And one of my favorites is one that many people may already know about now, but I reached out to them whenever I first came across them when there was a crowdfunding campaign. I was browsing the crowdfunding websites. It was one day looking for something that I might support or maybe waste my money on. And I came across a crowdfunding campaign for the launch of a new college that they were crowdfunding to raise money to start a new higher ed institution. And that alone,
GoFundMe?
it was on what's the other one? Starts with a P.
Patreon?
I think it starts with. No, I forget. Sorry, I'll have to look back.
It's okay.
But it was on one of those, like Kickstarter, and there was a video, and it was basically this vision that they wanted to flip higher education upside down. They wanted to create a model of higher ed that was largely, and in some ways, it really tied to a lot of the great experiments and initiatives of the 60s and 70s, and even back to the 30s. Like you're in Vermont, Goddard College is an incredible, vision for an alternative model of higher ed that I celebrate and have followed for years. And so essentially what Wayfinding Academy was a place that gave students great voice and choice and involvement in the community, being co-creators of the community. It was going to be an alternative to college. It would be a place where students would not go knowing what they wanted to do with their lives, but a place for them to discover as they pursued an associates and self in society. And they would engage with the community. If you were intrigued by microbreweries, the part of your curriculum might be apprenticing with someone who founded a microbrewery. And this is in Portland, Oregon, and it's the school Wayfinding Academy, which some may have heard of. So it was Michelle Jones, and that was her moonshot. She was an organizational psychology professor at a college, at a traditional college or university, and she struggled with the fact that she had some students in her class that it just wasn't working. Higher ed was not the right fit, the traditional model. And she told the story of a student who he wanted to be a firefighter. His dad was a firefighter. His grandfather was a firefighter. And that's what he knew he wanted to do. But he was told the narrative in high school that you're supposed to go to college. That's how you're successful. That's the proper pathway to the good life. And so he did, and he went to college, and then he built up a lot of debt, and he graduated, and guess what he did? He became a firefighter. And for her, she really struggled with that idea. And certainly we can make a strong, compelling argument for the value of the liberal arts and, the rich discourse around ideas and diversity. And yet, the argument from some groups like Wayfinding Academy is that doesn't have to be limited to the traditional higher education institution. It can happen in other places as well. So that is a compelling one because there are not many higher ed institutions that launch these days. We hear much more about those that are closing, but this is essentially the spirit of the micro school movement that's been leveraged to launch a small, compelling, mission-minded alternative college that's doing quite well in its third or fourth year now. So that was a great one. I actually have interviewed a lot of founders of micro schools on the K-12 level as well. I try not to make the artificial barrier between grade levels and ages as much. I look for innovation wherever it might be found. So there are a lot of others like Wayfinding Academy on the K-12 level that have inspired me, like Anastasia Academy in Colorado by Kelly Tinkley. She founded this really wonderful self-directed school. and Stuart Grauer in California, who started the Grauer School that has these wonderful, what he calls pockets of democracy within their school, very heavy on expeditionary and experiential learning. He wrote a great book called Fearless Teaching as well.
Yeah.
So all of those kind of come together. It's sort of a common moonshot around launching a new kind of learning community that's rich with hope and learner agency and ownership.
Hmm. So each of these is an individual moonshot, lofting a new school into orbit.
Yeah.
And still within that messy framework of institutional diversity.
Right.
In the chat box, Tom Hames from Texas mentioned that the Wayfinding Academy sounds a bit like College Unbound, and we had the provost in our program about a month ago. Do you think that together is this perhaps a new movement to have very learner-oriented, very small-scale education, both at K through 12 and post-secondary?
I do. And when you ask me to introduce myself, I describe myself as an ethnographic researcher. I end up being playing the role of a futurist in terms of helping my own organization, other organizations sometimes figure out where things are going. And
Yes.
and so as I look at trends and patterns, I have my list of about 15 common features that I'm looking for as I'm studying trends, which are likely to stick and which are not. And I've kind of taken a bit of a contrarian viewpoint, for example, where Clayton Christensen has argued that this massive decline in the number of higher ed institutions, that he's made the prediction that they're going to just continue to drop. And you're in a part of the country where we have seen that a lot of New England colleges,
Yes.
small ones that are struggling, and
Yes.
their enrollment is dropping below what seems to be a sustainable size, at least with their current financial models. And I'm looking at that a little differently. I've broadened my view. I'm looking at education beyond the formal accredited institutions as well. I call this outsider higher education. These are examples of people who are building learning communities that may not have courses, credits, degrees, or programs associated with them, nor do they necessarily have accreditation associated. I would put your forum here in that category of outsider higher education. There can be just as rich of an exchange in a forum like this as what some people might experience in a credit-based learning experience. And so when I look at that and I look at that pattern, my prediction is that we will actually have more higher education institutions than what we have, perhaps 3 or 4 times more, or maybe even 10 times more. But they're just not necessarily going to be called higher ed institutions or colleges or universities as we think of them. So I do see the Wayfinding Academies and some of these others as an expression of that new form of higher education innovation. They're kind of drawing the line. Like there's the outside higher ed, there's the traditional higher ed, and then there are these micro college kinds of innovations that are, if it's a Venn diagram, they're kind of in between the two.
Yeah. So we have outsider and we have micro schools. This is great. I mean, these are two huge movements to think of, and thank you for including the forum within them. Before I follow up with more questions, friends, let me just remind you that you have the different ways to ask questions yourselves. Either if you're in the chat box, or if you want to use the video, so you can join us on stage and add to the diversity of backgrounds. So between brick and blank white, we should have a third at least. And again, click the question mark if there's a question that you'd like us to put out. Those are really striking. In fact, if you want to carry your metaphor further, your micro schools are almost like microsats. The microsatellite idea of creating very small probes. Have there been any other projects that have really impressed you from this 2 years of podcasting? Any other major moonshots, especially for traditional higher education?
Yeah, so I will say, building on what we just talked about with these startups that always intrigue me, I'm fascinated with startups. I'd spent time on the East Coast, West Coast visiting education startups and things like that as part of my work over the years as well. One of my early projects was I visited 100 different learning organizations that were considered highly innovative or outside the box. And so I've done that for a long time. At the end of that, I developed, based upon my research, I developed a list of common traits, 10 common traits that are present in leaders and innovative organizations that seem to persist and thrive. And and I came to believe that it's almost impossible to take a traditional learning organization and turn it into something that's truly different and innovative. I became very skeptical over the years. But as I did this podcast, I started inviting different guests on, and they started to convince me otherwise. It's in the last 5 years that I've actually seen more examples of people taking existing entities, existing communities, and pivoting them and doing new things with them. In fact, I had a great conversation with John Couch, who is the just recently retired vice president of education at Apple. And he's the author of a book called Rewiring Education, largely focused on K-12. But it's really that. It's rewiring education. It's going into an existing organization and rewiring it and updating the wiring for the current times. And that was that he really got me thinking about that more. In fact, I think I'd been moving toward that position for a year or two, but it was right in the middle of that interview that it kind of clicked for me. And I said, okay, I need to soften my stance on this, because oftentimes I'd be speaking to a group and they'd say, well, this is great to hear about all these new organizations and these new launches. How do I do it in my existing school? And I would candidly tell people sometimes, I have a 90% chance that you're not going to be successful if you try it in your existing school. That's what I would tell them. And now I'm changing. Now I think people at least have a 50% chance of success.
Well, that's working its way up. Next, there'll be a D level. But what do you see rewiring meaning? What does rewiring traditional higher ed look like?
Well, I think for John Couch, the way he would frame it is he's looking at it in terms of desired outcomes. The world has changed. Has the education system adapted to equip people for that changing world? Are we still equipping them for a context and a culture that doesn't really exist anymore? And that's a pretty common discourse, right, that people have as they talk about 21st century skills and things like that. So that's certainly one way that people frame the notion of rewiring. It's asking if our learning communities are really effective at equipping people to thrive for, work, life, and learning in a 21st and potentially 22nd century world. I think, I guess that's probably where most people end up. I'm intrigued by that, and I think that's a good, important conversation. But I'm actually personally motivated by some other values as well. For example, I believe that we have an obligation not only to think about the future, but to think about the present circumstance of learners and ask the question, are we creating truly humane learning environments? If we're in a democracy or a republic here in the United States, and it depends, I believe, upon nurturing people who believe that their voice matters and who have a sense of agency, that they're not just kind of going wherever a leader might tell them blindly, that we challenge, and that's sort of a part of our culture that's incredibly important. And yes. For me, when I think about rewiring education, the question that I'm often asking is are our learning communities designed to nurture people to have competence and confidence and be engaged, active citizens in that kind of a world? Or are we nurturing complacent, compliant consumers unintentionally? And so I am intrigued by seeking out people who I think are nurturing that kind of agency and ownership.
People you want activist students, not passive consumers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Creators and doers. Speaking of creators, we have a question from Mark Corbett Wilson. So let's flash this on the screen. This is California education law recently changed, and now all schools must be accredited. Small, formally state-approved schools are being forced to pay for accreditation or closing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so whenever I look at futures, whenever I'm trying to identify what's going to happen, what's going to play out, I have a list of traits that I look for. So I look for things like domain jumping. Like oftentimes an innovation starts in one domain, it jumps to another, or level jumping. The innovation might start in kindergarten and jump to higher ed, or vice versa. I look at convergence, different ideas that are coming together and creating something new. Henry Jenkins' work, right? I look at the maturation process of the technology. At what point is it in its development, and has it reached a level of a level where we forget about it, or is it something that we still get caught on, right? I mean, if we still run into so many snafus that it inhibits our use. I look at adoption rates and traits. I look at changing metaphors. I'm intrigued by that one. When we start noticing people using different language to talk about something, that's often a signal that there's a cultural shift about to happen. I look at funding growth, revenue potential. I look at the simplicity. Is it simple enough or concrete enough that it can spread? Because oftentimes if an idea is too abstract, even if it's the best idea in the world, it doesn't spread. In fact, I'm convinced the best ideas rarely spread. If it's, and then this is coming to the question. So that with regard to the question, one of the things I look for is it a superior model but currently muzzled? In other words, it's something that seems to have great promise. If we really look at it candidly and we assess it on any number of factors, it's better than what we have, but it's being muzzled oftentimes by regulation. In many cases, now it's not always true, but in many cases, that's a sign of an innovation that is going to blow up and do some incredible things in the future, but just not right now. There's a current policy landscape that may be holding it back. So then I look alongside that for evidence of potential policy changes that create fertile soil or that remove nutrients from the soil for these innovations to grow. And on the state level, and this is, a vision for the United States, as many people envisioned it originally, is that the states are incubators for experimentation. And we're seeing that play out. So where we see California, perhaps at this moment in time, moving in terms of the experiment of higher regulation, we see other states that are potentially moving in other directions, where they might be removing regulation. And many people argue for a balance, right? So I'm looking at it on the macro level, and I think that it might be unfortunate in the short term that those unnecessary regulations are going to restrict really incredible innovations and learning communities that are really benefiting the lives of learners who wouldn't benefit otherwise. So that's discouraging to me. At the same time, there may be some really valid regulations that are preventing people from doing things that are unethical or even unlawful, or treating young people or learners of different ages as guinea pigs a little bit too much, right? That it's not responsible experimentation. So I see some real value for that. I'm not necessarily convinced that the state of California, where they're going, and I'm not an expert on the policies in education, I'm not convinced that all the policies they're pushing forward and the accreditation approach is going to achieve the ends that some people think it will. I'm concerned that it's actually going to diminish some really promising innovations along the way. But only time will tell.
Well, that's a fantastic answer, both methodological and content-oriented. And thank you, Mark, for a terrific question. I hope California doesn't strangle all those innovations in the bud. We have another question from Lil Badur. And let's see if we can bring Lil up on stage. There's always this dramatic moment where we have to see if the connection will work. And there she is. Hello, Lil. Hi.
Hi, we can hear you now, I think.
Okay, great. Hi. Thanks for the talk. Question for you. I'm wondering if you have any moonshots on evaluation of learning. And I'm in more of a practical role. We serve the workforce, so it's not in higher ed. They're already out there, so we're really set on applicability and actionable learning. So wondering what you see as the future in evaluation beyond just retrieval of learning and the Kirkpatrick model with results and behavior change.
Sure. So workforce development is an area I never expected to get involved in originally, being more focused upon formal K-12 and higher ed communities. But my work really started to resonate with people in the workforce development arena over the last number of years. I had a strange experience on a Friday night a number of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I got this email from a name that didn't look quite familiar, and I Googled the name, and that was the same name of a person who penned the 9/11 report. And so I thought, wow, is this fake? I didn't know what it was. So I replied back, and I am answering your question. I'm just giving it in a narrative form. And it ended up being someone from Markle, the economic task force at Markle, the think tank. And they ended up contracting me to do a little work for them. At that point, I think up till about last year or the year before, I'd probably written more informal articles on micro-credentials and digital badges than anyone on the planet. I think I'd written about 150 different articles. Everything I'd learned, I just would put out there to get feedback from people. And I became really intrigued by workforce development along the lines of the concept of credentialism. So credentialism, and this is all kind of tied together to the Markle work. But credentialism is a notion that emerged especially in the 70s, an argument that we are restricting people from access to jobs unintentionally by having unnecessary credentials required in order to be able to even apply for particular jobs. So, for example, there might be, and I've actually done this, I've done audits of jobs at different companies to find out the skills and dispositions that are necessary to do that job. And then I've compared that to what requirements, whether or not those would actually be learned or taught within a typical associate's or bachelor's degree program. So whenever I found that there was this disconnect, that I interviewed HR departments at different companies, Fortune 500 companies and others, and I asked them about this. What they told me was they put a bachelor's degree required just to vet out what they would call the chaff. Like they didn't have the time to go through and review all of these possible candidates. So they just put bachelor's degree required, and then they could just restrict it and narrow it down. I became really concerned about that, and I'm fascinated. Markle has since actually launched something called Skillful in Colorado that's teaching companies how to create competency-based hiring processes and hiring funnels so that it's not based upon credentials, but it's based upon people's demonstration of competency, perhaps even as part of the application process. And I actually am working on a new initiative right now around challenge-based hiring funnels, which would essentially make it easier for employers to post jobs, help them design kind of game-based or scenario-based or challenge-based funnels, levels. Someone would apply, and the first level they would be given a challenge, second level a challenge. If they make it to level 4, then they get an interview. But the idea is that it allows the employers to actually interview a broader array or invite a broader array of people to apply, regardless of credential, and find the best talent, while also creating learning opportunities for the people applying. So the idea is you could apply for 10 jobs and not get a single one, but you'd actually be more competent than you were when you started. So we actually would be leveraging the job process to develop new competencies. When you do that, and if we were to get traction around that kind of initiative, we could begin to develop more discrete credentials associated with people's informal learning as well. And I see some great potential around that. In fact, I'll be one of the keynotes at EPIC in Paris coming up here in October that deals with open recognition, and I keynoted there a few years ago as well. And it's a great community in Europe. I feel like they're a little bit ahead of us, many of us in the US around this space. I don't know if I'm talking around your question a lot, but I see a ton of incredible opportunity here in the workforce development space around creating really rich, engaging kind of platforms for people to learn and to develop incremental growth. The other thing I'll say around your question is I became fascinated a number of years ago around the concept of progressive credentialing. And this came out of early literature in the 70s and 80s from medical schools. What happened was that there would be medical students who would then begin to intern, or they'd step into a hospital setting, and they had the knowledge to engage in a lot of procedures, but they didn't actually have the MD. So what they did is they created a progressive credentialing system where you could once you demonstrated your expertise, you would be given additional rights or responsibilities on the job. But they had to track this and document it in a significant way. And then by the time you get your MD, then you have the full spectrum of procedures that you can engage in. And progressive credentialing is actually being used in healthcare right now. There's a massive crisis in healthcare systems to find CNAs and entry-level nurses and others, or then moving on to the RN. And progressive credentialing could be quite helpful. I've talked to a couple of companies about this, especially companies that persistently have shortages of employment shortages. They need 1,000 employees and they can't find them in a particular area. This is where we have a chance to maybe reimagine the system, where historically we used to always talk about go to school, graduate, get a job, and then get promoted. What if we instead create stronger systems where people are getting in the employment, they're getting the employment earlier on, and then the schooling or the learning is happening along the way, right? We have the progressive credentialing happening. So that's actually one of the most exciting areas that I'm seeing right now. I see a lot of great educational innovation in that space. And I'm on the advisory board for the Indiana CPA Society right now, where they're actually looking at this concept with regard to the ongoing competence of CPAs in a changing landscape. Accountants, their work is changing because of technology. Right now, many professions are still stuck on the model of CEUs. Basically, you go to an event or a conference for 10 hours, and that somehow verifies that you're competent enough to maintain your job, right? And in some cases, when I did early research for one client, I'm a dentist and I go to Hawaii and go to a conference and listen to vendors present on new dental products, and that somehow makes me a better dentist. I mean, that's questionable, right? And plus, there's a body of literature to show that people are most competent in the health professions maybe 5 to 10 years out. And then at year 15 to 17, they actually start to decline in their competence in many fields. So the idea of ongoing professional development that's tied to competency-based assessments or credentials, that could produce positive health outcomes for the entire nation if we could actually make that shift. I don't know.
Thanks.
Did I go off track too much?
I appreciate how you're really pushing for linking academia and practice closer together, and then you're also looking at it in a broad view. I don't want to dominate time, but if you can get to it this hour, I'd love to hear what you think of evaluating individual learning opportunities, whether they're formal or informal.
Well, let's take a quick shot at that. We have some more questions in the pipeline, but let's take a quick shot at that if we could.
Yeah. So in terms of evaluation, this is one of the books I'm working on right now is called Learning Beyond Letter Grades. It's a critique of the letter grade system, that the construct that we've used to evaluate people in formal education, I believe has a massive amount of limitations, and it doesn't accomplish what we want. And in fact, it leads people to embrace a culture of earning versus a culture of learning. And I would argue that when we step out of formal education, there's actually much for formal education to learn from the things that are happening elsewhere. When we get into more performance-based assessments, I'm a big advocate for creating as authentic of assessments as we can, ones that are not tied to really restrictive rubrics that oversimplify the process. I was trained, my doctorate's in instructional technology, so I was trained as an instructional designer, and I know how to break things down into do a robust task analysis and then build assessments that are carefully aligned with the various tasks and all of that good stuff. But I also have a strong sympathy for a more gestalt approach to this, that oftentimes we, this is too cliche, but we cut down all of the trees and we put them into nice, tidy categories and stacks by oak, maple, pine, whatever it might be, instead of wandering through the forest and appreciating the beautiful ecosystem. So what I'm intrigued by is I'm intrigued by some of the emerging practices where people are not trying to overly simplify measures just because it's easy to measure. Now, this is a really crude analogy, but the one I actually used with some colleagues internally the other day was when we start getting to measurements of learning and metrics, here's my greatest concern of where we are right now in the world of analytics and big data, which is another area of personal interest right now. What we're doing in many cases is we have a yardstick and we're trying to measure the height of a person. And because the person is taller than the yardstick, we cut off their legs so that they fit our measurement. right? And I know that that sounds incredibly crude, but that's essentially in practice what we risk doing sometimes. We're trying to force people into the construct of what's easy to measure or the tool that we have to measure. That's actually one of my greatest concerns with our analytics movement right now. Now, with that said, at the same time, in terms of the future of assessment, I do believe that the algorithmic future is going to be an incredibly powerful one. I think that traditional objective assessments and tests as we know them will eventually disappear as we become more sophisticated and nuanced with algorithmic tools, so that we can put people into learning situations and environments, and we can monitor their progress in incredibly detailed ways. And there's no need to stop them and have them take a test or assessment, that the tools are embedded enough that they're giving us indicators of growth and progress all along the way. So we have a true snapshot of their growth and progress at any point. It's a little bit futuristic. I think we're probably 5 to 10 years out from seeing that happen in a more wide scale way. But I do see some promise with it, but also some real risks.
Well, thank you. Lil, thank you so much for your great question. And you really dug deep into what Bernard is thinking of. Thank you so much. We have other people lined up. The questions are now beginning to flow. So let's look at what Myron Williams, I believe Williams, has to ask. Yes. To follow up on Mark's question, how do the regional accrediting associations support innovation in higher education? Great question, Myron.
Yeah. I have made a vow to try to change and be more positive about this, so I'm trying to decide how to respond. I wrote an article a number of years ago in a moment of frustration, and I'm very sympathetic and appreciative of some of the good work that's happening in regional accrediting bodies, and I want to support and celebrate some of the people who are very well-meaning and doing good work in the regional accrediting bodies. So I want to start by saying that. And the same thing goes for the U.S. Department of Education, that there are really good things that are happening there. Of course, I do have concerns about policies on the federal level and in regional accrediting areas whenever I see them unnecessarily inhibiting innovation. The biggest problem that I'm seeing right now with both state level policy, federal policy, as well as the regional accreditors is it comes down to use of language and definition of terms. That the terminology and the language that we're using in some of the policies are still tied to metaphors that are fading out, or they're tied to constructs that don't necessarily have as much relevance today. So for example, a lot of policy can be tied to the notion of the Carnegie unit and the credit hour. And that limits a lot of innovation. We can have very rich, rigorous, not rigorous in the sense of painful, but in terms of challenging, really rich, challenging, high standards in our learning environments. And we can do that without using the traditional constructs of letter grades and credit hours and the like. And that's an area where I would really love to see the state and federal agencies and their regional accreditors all come together and help us build a new, more current lexicon of terminology that frees us from some of the old constructs, because we're still tied to some of that language, and people know it, and people talk about it. You get the competency. Our school is part of the competency-based education network. We've tried to do some good work around changing the conversation, but there's still a persistent lag around some of this vocabulary. And as many of us, people who have a background in sort of the humanities, we know that language, our language and our vocabulary shapes our thoughts and the constructs that dominate our culture sometimes.
Well, that's a great answer. And as a humanist, I appreciate the attention to language, which you said earlier today. Great question, Myron. Speaking of questions, we have another one, and let's see, I think this is a video question, so if we could get, let's see, I think this is Richard Price. Hey, Richard, back on. Wonderful guest who was on our show before. Hello, Richard. Good to see you again.
Hey, good to see you too. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can. Actually, your audio is great.
Oh, wonderful. We just moved to a new office building, so I'm not sure the Wi-Fi is in here. So I appreciate, I'm a research associate at the Christensen Institute, like Clayton Christensen, who you referenced earlier. And I liked your expansion, I guess. We talk a lot about some of the perils for traditional institutions, and you expanded it to the growth that'll happen beyond that. So one of the factors that we actually see is potentially difficult for traditional institutions is this workforce focus and competencies and skills being the new measuring stick. Do you see that as helping to catalyze that growth beyond traditional institutions, or do you see that as kind of a counterforce for it? Like, do you see these micro schools and other things thriving in that environment, or maybe struggling with the workforce? I guess the pendulum is swinging more towards workforce focus these days.
Right. I certainly see some of the most promising innovation around workforce development happening outside of higher education. There are examples of wonderful partnerships. For example, the very well-known ASU Starbucks partnership around online learning and equipping people. But that's not really equipping. That's not really the workforce development conversation. That's just a higher ed corporate partnership that helps people achieve new credentials and the like. And we do see examples, though, of some higher ed institutions that have built entire units that have developed some expertise in more workforce development and training types of issues. But again, I think that I'm seeing most of the innovation happening outside of that space. Part of it is, too, I believe, is that it's less regulated. There's much more flexibility. I was mentioning the vocabulary, the terminology and lexicon challenges. And when we look at some of these innovations in the startups, that's why I really like looking at those spaces. They're not encumbered by that, and their minds aren't encumbered by that. They're not starting with some of that traditional construct or vocabulary. In terms of where that's going to go in higher ed, I suspect that we're going to see a handful of higher ed institutions that are really capitalized. They'll really step into that space and they'll become well-known and respected. I'm not sure where that's going to go more broadly. Now, I'm at a university where we were a traditional liberal arts school, but we've embraced a breadth of healthcare programs. And healthcare programs are very much more in line with the way workforce development people think. We're more competency and proficiency based anyway. We have very clear benchmarks. We have a physician's assistant program, and they're measuring even their bedside manner and their communicative fluency. They're measuring it step by step, very carefully and meticulously throughout the entire program. And certainly we see that happening. And the external accreditors for those professions are actually informing and shaping that. Now, what I see and wonder about, though, is because a lot of the influence for that is happening from these external accreditors, we're only one policy change away from that also stepping outside of higher education. Right now, I need to be I mean, in order to be a physician's assistant, I have to go to a university or to become a registered nurse or something like that. But look at, for example, in nursing. To become a CNA, I don't have to go to university. That can be programming that's part of high school. It can be programming that's embedded into a hospital or some other health clinic. It can be embedded elsewhere. And that's actually where I suspect that we're going to see much, much more growth is corporations and other companies building their own training mechanisms, possibly partnering with faculty and others to pull in the expertise. I could see a decline in higher education participation pretty significantly if that takes off as I expect it to. I don't know. Did I talk to your question directly enough?
Yeah, I think so. I really appreciate it.
Oh, okay, very good. By the way, one of the people I interviewed that I really enjoyed was Brian Kaplan, the economist who wrote the book, The Case Against Education. And he basically argues that we need to decrease the number of people in college, that's one of the best ways to increase economic equity. Now, I'm not sure that I buy his entire argument. In fact, one of the questions I asked him on my interview is, what's the best argument against what you're saying? And he gives a pretty compelling argument against himself, too. But he was
a great guest on the forum.
Oh, you had him on here, too. Okay, great. Well, it does really fit into this larger conversation about sort of the workforce development. I'm also curious about how much regulation is going to happen, though. I mean, another direction this could go, because regulation is always so unpredictable, is if states and other entities start adding more regulations for what I'm currently calling outsider higher ed.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of currency for that. Friends, I hate to rush this. We have one more question, and then we're out of time. Richard, so good of you to ask this really good question. And again, a really deep answer. We have a question from Roxanne Risk, a longtime friend of the forum, wonderful person. And she asks, often innovation involves risk-taking, and that often needs substantial support and buy-in from stakeholders. The question is, how do we bring in the new wiring and mitigate risks, especially for faculty, etc.?
Yeah. Yeah, let me look at that. I'm going to read that one just to make sure. Innovation involves risk-taking, often needs substantial support and buy-in from stakeholders. How do we bring in the new wiring? Yeah, that's a great question. I will say this. I think risk-taking, the part that you mentioned at the beginning here, there's a lot of conversation around higher ed institutions, for example, more of them adding R&D arms or units. Like what a Fortune 500 company might have as an R&D unit, but actually building a unit that's seeking to incubate new innovations, and both innovations that are sustaining innovations. Since we just had a guest from a talk from Clayton Christensen Clayton Christensen Institute, so sustaining innovation, so incrementally improving existing educational products and services or learning environments, as well as those potentially disruptive ones. And I'm a part of a network of people who are launching a lot of those R&D units in different universities. I think that's a key piece in terms of buy-in, is universities that are in a position that have excess capital, either from endowments, gifts, or because they're just very efficient and they have excess capital from tuition, assigning some of that to R&D. Historically, many universities are not comfortable doing that. They take that money and they use it to build new buildings, as opposed to engaging in R&D and the like. I'm a big fan of Michael Schragg's work, The Innovator's Hypothesis, a researcher in MIT, researcher, and he has this great statement that good ideas are bad for your organization. And the concept is that we want to create testable hypotheses as quickly as possible. Move away from a good idea, turn it into a testable hypothesis. And along with that, I also had a guest on my show, Matt Candler, who's the founder of 4.0 Schools. And he's founded tons of charter schools around the country. And one of the things he discovered is that he was experimenting on children in a way that he didn't feel like was appropriate. Like, he started all these innovative schools, but when he began to ask himself, do I really know if this works? He didn't always have the data or the evidence. So then he shifted and he created 4.0 Schools, which essentially gives micro grants and supports people to try smaller, quick experiments to gain actionable insight that then leads them to make a next decision. When we're talking about this innovation and this rewiring, I've become a real advocate for higher ed institutions and K-12 institutions to embrace that mindset, to not think about the massive moonshot all the time, and to instead think about a grand vision or goal that you have in terms of a learner outcome, and then begin to build communities that engage in short, quick, inexpensive experiments that frame testable hypotheses, and with small resources, maybe a $5,000 budget. Michael Schrag talks about 5 people, 5 days, 5 experiments, each get $5,000. Like, think about these smaller pieces, and then we can begin to build a culture of innovation. I think that's also an interesting way to build some neat financial models. This is the kind of thing you could get corporate partners and others to jump into and to support, as opposed to jumping into seeking the 7-figure plus kind of support for new initiatives.
That's a really, really good answer. And I also like the way that you, in answering so many of these questions, Bernard, you're able to answer the question about good moonshots. And even if these aren't necessarily moonshot ideas, these are nevertheless great, big, useful, and thoughtful ideas. Friends, we're right at the end of the hour. We're out of time, in fact. And I hate to stop things because there's some more questions in the pipe. And Bernard, you have so many good thoughts, so many good ideas. First, let me thank you. Thank you so much for this generous hour that you've managed to claw free between reinventing your campus and topping off your publishers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just to tell people, the best way to find you is at Moonshotedu for the podcast.
Yeah, and connecting with me on Twitter, it's just at BERNARDBULL.
Nice.
I also have my blog, etail.org. Is
Nice.
a good place to connect. You'll see that I haven't written much the last month because of my deadline with the publisher. I disappear every so often when I have a new book due, but otherwise I'm writing pretty consistently.
Excellent. Excellent. That makes us all happy, publishers and readers alike. I'm looking forward to hearing more and more of your work. Thank you again for your time. But everybody, don't go yet. I have to show you what we're up to for the next week. But I do want to thank you again, Bernard. And as we bring this up, let me just note that wonderful mention he made that the forum is a kind of outsider learning project. What a great idea. Let's pursue that later on. Well, next week, speaking of outsiders, we have a tremendous show for you where we have four guests who are all people who've worked on a new book about the alt-ac career path. That is the alternative to academic career path. Wonderful, brilliant folks, including Joe Fruscione, who we've had as a guest before. They'll be speaking about their book and what it means to pursue an academic career path when you're not following the usual faculty route. This is an incredibly important topic, and we're really privileged to have some really cutting-edge thinkers on that. So please come by next week, first show of September for that. Now also, beyond that, we have finished our book club. I just got an email from the author praising our discussion, which is very sweet, and I'll share that later on. But pretty soon we'll have to think about our next reading and what we'd like to read. So if you have any nonfiction books to think about for the future of education and technology, start thinking about them. If you'd like to get books that we've discussed before, our bookstore has tons of titles. Buying them there helps support our work here. So please do that if you can. And if you'd like to continue our conversation, and I think you all do because there are lots of questions coming up, you can follow us on Twitter, but also remember we have our discussion groups on Slack, LinkedIn, and Facebook, which already had comments and ideas for this program. So once again, thank you all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your great ideas and suggestions. And we'll see you online, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.